We don't have time in this class to go through all of the different problems we can have with an immune system that goes a little haywire. But I do want to talk about two of the most common hypersensitivities that you're probably familiar with if you don't actually experience them, which many people do. Your book talks about type 1, 2, 3, and 4 hypersensitivities, and we're going to cover type 1 and type 4 because those are the most common and relevant. Hypersensitivities are cases where your immune system becomes, let's just use the word, overly sensitive to something that isn't actually dangerous. And so we often refer to these as allergies. So it's an antigenic response that is an overreaction to what is needed. In order for a person to have a hypersensitivity, they need to become sensitized to some type of allergen. So we can talk about allergen. It's really an antigen that causes an allergic reaction. And there are, again, 4 different types, and we're going to talk about anaphylactic hypersensitivities as well as cell-mediated hypersensitivities. So type 1, anaphylactic reactions, it's a very general term. I know you've probably heard the term anaphylactic shock, but it isn't necessarily anaphylactic shock. If you have hay fever, that's considered a type 1 anaphylactic reaction. Because this is a general term for when IgE antibodies combine with antigens and result in mast cells releasing histamine. And so if it's happening locally, then you'll see something like hay fever or asthma, or you might get hives on your skin. Now, when this happens systemically, that's when we talk about anaphylactic shock. If you have these inflammatory mediators circulating systemically, it can result in circulatory system collapse. It can result in your airway being blocked. So this is when we see things like anaphylactic shock. So it really depends on whether it's a local reaction or a systemic reaction, whether or not it's actually really dangerous. I'm going to show you the whole process in a moment, but I want to show you this slide first and just explain what degranulation is. We've talked about it at least peripherally when we talked about the immune system. Mast cells and basophils, many of which are in your tissues, contain these little granules in them. And we looked at basophils under the microscope, so you're familiar with those. The basophils are in your blood. Mast cells are in your tissues. They're kind of little sentinel cells. So here we have our little granules, and notice that there are receptors here. These are the receptors. They bind to IgE, that's what this is. You can see the Y-shaped antibody. This is the Fc region. So these IgE antibodies bind to the surface of mast cells and basophils. And when an allergen binds to these IgE antibodies, it causes degranulation. So you see these granules are released onto the surface, and they open up and allow histamine and other mediators to be produced. Okay, so usually you have to have an antigen that bridges the gap between 2 different antibodies that bind to the same antigen, and that triggers this degranulation. So histamine is the primary mediator. We also see leukotrienes and prostaglandins that are, when this occurs, being synthesized, and all of those have these inflammatory effects like vasodilation and fluid coming to the surface. So you have things like a runny nose, for example, or you get your sinuses are all plugged up and swollen. Prostaglandins and leukotrienes can have the effect of smooth muscle contraction. So you see bronchial constriction, and the people begin to have a much harder ability to breathe. It might trigger an asthma attack. All of that is triggered by the release of these inflammatory mediators. All right, so here we have them. Histamine, I just was talking about this, leukotrienes and prostaglandin. Here's the process. So here's our first exposure. So let's say that where you sleep at night, there's a shrub, flowering shrub outside your bedroom window, and it produces pollen in the spring. And this pollen, the first spring, you get exposed to this pollen. It ends up being phagocytized by an antigen-presenting cell, presented to a T helper cell. And also, you're going to have B cells that have bound to this antigen, and so you have activated T helper cells. That T helper cells then will activate B cells. So you see that the B cell is bound to that antigen and the receptor. It's presented to T helper. T helper cell is going to release cytokines. These B cells then are going to differentiate and produce plasma cells, and these plasma cells are pumping out all this IgE. Now this comes back to the prior slide. The IgE will bind to the surface of mast cells or basophils. You see the granules are intact here. And then the next season, that plant blooms again and you get more of these pollen molecules in your body. And now these cells are all primed with IgE on the surface. Once you have this bridge connection formed between two different IgEs on the surface of this mast cell or basophil, it's going to degranulate. And that's going to release those mediators that we were just talking about. So you're going to have histamines released from the granules, leukotrienes and prostaglandins synthesized, and they're all going to have that sort of collective effect of, and it depends, of course, on how sensitive you are, but, you know, smooth muscle contraction, vasodilation, so drippy nose, potential asthma from the bronchial constrictions. But again, if this is something that's particularly systemic in your body and all these mediators are released at once, then you can have a systemic anaphylactic shock reaction. And this is when these kinds of allergic reactions get life-threatening. All right, so this slide just shows where these mediators get into your blood as a result of this allergic reaction. So this is kind of nice, just showing the effect of prostaglandin. It's dilating blood vessels, but it's constricting the bronchioles. It's resulting in pain, so you might have a headache as a result of this. The histamine, serotonin, and bradykinin are also mediators that are produced. They increase blood flow. You can have hives. This is what this is showing here. These can cause you to have a drippy nose, we've talked about before. Here's the bronchial constriction, so you see the woman with her inhaler. All right, so these are just the effects of these mediators on your tissues. All right, so localized anaphylaxis is not a huge problem. It's usually from food or pollen. In the upper respiratory tract, you end up, if it's localized to the upper respiratory tract, you end up with things like hay fever, itchy eyes, coughing, sneezing, things that you associate with seasonal allergies. If it's in the lower respiratory tract, you might have asthma or experience a little bit of shortness of breath. So those are all pretty tolerable, at least they're not life-threatening reactions. What about systemic anaphylaxis? So we typically see this with some kinds of foods, things like bee stings. Oftentimes, if you're injected with the antigen, that can be more frequently associated with systemic anaphylaxis. The problem here is those inflammatory mediators. Again, the blood vessels in your periphery will get bigger, but your blood volume is the same. So the pipes got bigger, but the volume is the same, the pressure will drop. And you can end up with circulatory system collapse because your blood pressure is too low. People can also have swelling. They can start to have trouble breathing and swelling in their tongue, and so they can end up with they can block their airway essentially. People with known risk of systemic anaphylaxis, so you've been stung by a bee before, or maybe you're allergic to peanuts, they will often carry an EpiPen. The epinephrine pen will constrict blood vessels and help you breathe and hopefully open up your airway, allow you to hopefully survive your anaphylactic experience. It doesn't always work. We have people, again, who are at risk for this, have EpiPens, epinephrine pens available, but there are certainly examples of people who have really serious anaphylactic reactions, for example, for eating peanut butter and accidentally eat peanut butter, and then even the EpiPen isn't enough to prevent a life-threatening anaphylactic response where people have died. Any food can cause allergy, but there are 8, so we call them the big 8 in food service. The big 8 food allergens, these are the ones that are the most common. And so there's a list here: eggs, peanuts, tree-grown nuts, milk, fish, crustaceans, wheat, soy. Here's the soy. Most children who have a food allergy develop tolerance as they age, so it's not uncommon at all for little kids to start off with an allergy and outgrow it. But some people do have lifelong food allergies, and peanuts, for example, and tree nuts are particularly dangerous. That they're not the most common kind of food allergy. It's actually crustaceans that are the most common, shellfish, but the peanuts tend to be the most dangerous in terms of being life-threatening. So people who work in restaurants have to be really careful to avoid something called cross-contact. So if someone comes in and says, I have a peanut allergy, they will usually cook that individual's food in dishes that are reserved for people with allergies that never have any nuts ever cooked in them, because just trace amounts of these antigens can actually cause an anaphylactic reaction in someone with a severe food allergy. All right, so that's type 1 hypersensitivities, and our last video is going to cover type 4 hypersensitivities.